Deep in the archives, where classified files gathered dust and witnesses were sworn to silence, there are Bigfoot encounters so bizarre that they were deemed too dangerous for public knowledge. Today, we will expose the most mind-bending Bigfoot sightings you were never supposed to discover. Forbidden accounts of creatures so otherworldly and impossible that even hardened investigators refuse to believe what they documented. On October 13, 2023, Emma Rodriguez had been in the Olympic National Forest for only 3 hours when she first heard the sound that would haunt her nightmares forever. The low, resonant call seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet and echoing from the trees themselves. She froze on the trail, her heart pounding as the sound repeated, too deep and too complex to be produced by any known animal, yet carrying an unmistakable intelligence that suggested communication rather than simple vocalization. The forest around her had fallen completely silent, as if every living creature was holding its breath in terror of what had just announced its presence. Emma's camera equipment began malfunctioning the moment she tried to record the strange vocalizations, her devices shutting down at seemingly random intervals, despite having functioned perfectly just minutes before. Her GPS readings showed impossible coordinates that placed her in locations that didn't exist on any map, while her compass spun wildly as if something was actively interfering with her technology. The silence that followed the creature's call was so complete, it seemed to press against her eardrums like a living thing, broken only by the sound of her own panicked breathing and the crunch of leaves beneath her trembling feet. But beneath that silence, Emma began to detect something else, the almost imperceptible sound of something massive moving through the undergrowth with impossible stealth. When Emma finally worked up the courage to continue down the trail, she discovered massive footprints pressed deep into the soft earth, prints that measured nearly 18 inches in length and showed clear evidence of opposable thumbs. The tracks formed a deliberate pattern around the area where she'd been standing, as if something had been circling her position while she remained frozen in terror. Most disturbing was the realization that whatever had made these prints had approached to within mere feet of where she stood, close enough to touch her. Yet she had never seen or heard its approach through the dense undergrowth. The depth of the impression suggested something that weighed over 600 pounds, moving with a grace that defied its massive size. Emma's attempts to leave the area were immediately frustrated by obstacles that seemed too coordinated to be coincidental. Fallen trees blocked the trail she'd used to enter the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural occurrence. Her satellite phone produced only static and interference that seemed to intensify whenever she tried to call for help, as if something was actively jamming her communications to prevent her from sharing her discoveries with the outside world. The isolation that had seemed appealing when she'd planned this expedition now felt like a trap, with Emma beginning to realize that she was no longer the observer in this situation, but rather the observed. Every step she took seemed to be anticipated, every route she chose blocked by obstacles that appeared too convenient to be natural. The first direct sighting came as Emma struggled to find an alternate route through the dense forest, her panic growing with each blocked path and dead end. Through the trees ahead, she caught a glimpse of something enormous moving between the massive trunks with impossible stealth, a figure that stood upright like a human but possessed proportions that suggested a creature of incredible size and strength. The being seemed to be studying her from a distance, its movements coordinated and purposeful as it paralleled her desperate attempts to escape. When Emma tried to focus her camera on the creature, the device immediately shut down, leaving her with only the terrifying memory of eyes that reflected the filtered sunlight with unmistakable intelligence, and what appeared to be curiosity about her presence in its domain. Emma's terror escalated when she realized that the creature was not alone. Sounds of movement from multiple directions indicated that she was surrounded by several large beings that were coordinating their activities with a precision that suggested advanced communication abilities. The forest itself seemed to be working against her escape, with branches that caught at her clothing in ways that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, and roots that appeared to shift position to trip her at crucial moments. Her attempts to document what was happening were frustrated by equipment failures that occurred at the most crucial moments, as if whatever was watching her understood the importance of preventing her from gathering evidence of their existence. The creatures seemed to possess an understanding of human technology that was both impressive and deeply unsettling. Emma's frantic escape became a blur of terror as the forest closed in around her. The deeper she ran, the more the landscape twisted. Paths vanished, landmarks shifted, and the air grew thick with the scent of earth and something musky. Every time she paused, she could hear the creatures moving just out of sight, their footfalls muffled, guttural calls echoing like a language meant for the trees. At one point, Emma tumbled down a slope into a shallow creek. The water was icy, shocking her back to her senses. She scrambled up, only to see a massive shadow pass silently along the ridge above. The creature paused, its silhouette framed by moonlight, and Emma felt its gaze settle on her like a physical weight. She pressed herself against the bank, barely daring to breathe, as the being let out a low, rumbling sound that vibrated through her bones. The chase resumed, but now the creatures were driving her, not just following, but steering her with uncanny precision. Whenever she tried to double back or hide, a branch would snap or a stone would be thrown, forcing her to change direction. She caught glimpses of more than one figure moving in parallel, their eyes glinting in the darkness, their movements impossibly fast and coordinated. Emma realized with dread that she was being herded toward a destination she could neither see nor understand. Suddenly, the forest opened into a wide, unnatural clearing. The ground was covered in spirals of stones and bones, and the trees around the perimeter were marked with deep gouges and strange symbols. The air was thick with anticipation, and Emma felt as if she had stepped into the center of some ancient ritual. The largest creature emerged from the shadows, standing at the edge of the clearing, its breath steaming in the cold night air. It raised its arms and let out a series of calls, each one answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground tremble. Emma stood frozen, her mind racing. Was this a warning? A test? The creatures circled the clearing, their eyes never leaving her, their movements deliberate and measured. For a moment, time seemed to stretch and warp, the world narrowing to the circle of stones and the silent, watching eyes. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the ritual ended. The creatures melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone and trembling in the center of the clearing. She didn't wait to see if they would return. Driven by a surge of adrenaline, Emma fled into the darkness. The memory of the ritual burned into her mind. Even as she ran, she knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only a glimpse of a mystery that would never let her go. The psychological pressure of constant surveillance began to manifest in ways that Emma struggled to understand or control. She found herself anticipating the movements of her unseen watchers, adjusting her path to avoid areas where she sensed their presence, while simultaneously being herded along routes that led deeper into their territory. The creatures seemed to be learning from their observations of her behavior, adapting their tactics based on her responses, and becoming more sophisticated in their approach with each passing hour. Emma began to feel like a laboratory animal being studied by researchers whose intelligence far exceeded her own, trapped in an experiment whose purpose she couldn't begin to understand. The realization that she was being manipulated by something that could think and plan was more terrifying than simple predation. The most direct encounter came when Emma stumbled into a small clearing and found herself face to face with the massive creature that had been stalking her through the forest. The being stood over 8 feet tall, covered in dark hair that seemed to shimmer with an almost metallic quality in the filtered sunlight, with eyes that held an intelligence that was unmistakably aware and calculating. It studied her with the same intensity that she had been trying to use to study the forest, tilting its massive head as if trying to understand what kind of creature she was and what her intentions might be. The moment of eye contact lasted only seconds, but it left Emma with the chilling realization that she was being evaluated according to criteria she couldn't comprehend. The creature's expression seemed almost curious, as if it was encountering something as unusual to it as it was to her. Emma's attempt to slowly back away from the creature was met with a low vocalization that seemed to carry meaning, as if the being was trying to communicate something important or warn her about something she couldn't see. The sound was complex, with tonal variations that suggested it was part of a sophisticated language system, and Emma had the disturbing realization that the creature was actually trying to talk to her. When she continued to retreat, the creature's vocalizations became more insistent, and she could hear answering calls from the forest around her as other beings responded to what sounded like tactical coordination. The realization that she was surrounded by multiple intelligent creatures that were discussing her fate in a language she couldn't understand filled Emma with a terror that transcended anything she had ever experienced. The decision to run came when Emma heard the creatures beginning to move closer, their massive forms crashing through the underbrush with increasing boldness as they closed the distance between themselves and their subject. She turned and sprinted toward what she hoped was the direction of the main trail, her flight through the dark forest becoming a nightmare of stumbling over unseen obstacles and constantly looking over her shoulder for signs of pursuit. The creature's response was immediate and coordinated, with sounds of movement that indicated they were not willing to let their subject escape without a significant effort to recapture her. Their pursuit began with what sounded almost like disappointment, as if they had hoped for a different outcome from their attempted communication. The chase through the forest revealed the true extent of the creature's physical capabilities as they moved through the dense woodland with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for beings of their size. Emma could hear them crashing through the trees behind her, their pursuit coordinated in ways that suggested they were working together to cut off her escape routes and funnel her toward a destination of their choosing. The sounds of their movement indicated that they were not simply chasing her, but were actively herding her, using their superior knowledge of the terrain to guide her flight along paths that would eventually lead her back into their control. Their footsteps thundered through the forest with a rhythm that suggested they were matching each other's pace, working as a coordinated unit rather than individual predators. During her desperate flight, Emma began to notice that the very forest seemed to be conspiring with her pursuers, creating obstacles that slowed her progress while providing clear pathways for the creatures that hunted her through the darkness. Branches caught at her clothing with deliberate precision. Roots shifted to trip her at crucial moments, and the terrain itself seemed to funnel her toward areas where her pursuers could more easily corner her. Most disturbing was the growing realization that the sounds of pursuit were becoming more organized and strategic, with different voices calling to each other in what sounded like tactical coordination. The creatures were communicating constantly during the chase, sharing information about her location and coordinating their movements with military precision. As Emma stumbled through the undergrowth, her panic-stricken mind began to process details that her terror had initially obscured, fragments of understanding that painted an even more disturbing picture of her situation. The creatures pursuing her seemed to be using tools. She could hear the distinctive sounds of implements striking wood and stone, suggesting they possessed technology that no wild animal should have been able to create or use. Their vocalizations carried nuances that indicated not just communication, but complex language, with tonal variations that suggested they were discussing strategy and coordinating their efforts with a sophistication that rivaled human military operations. The realization that she was being hunted by something that could think, plan, and use tools was more terrifying than any simple animal attack. The forest around Emma began to take on an increasingly surreal quality as her flight continued, with shadows that moved independently of any visible source and sounds that seemed to come from directions that defied the laws of physics. She found herself running through areas that her rational mind insisted couldn't exist. clearings that were perfectly circular despite being surrounded by ancient trees, streams that flowed uphill, and rock formations that seemed to shift and change when she wasn't looking directly at them. The pursuit behind her continued relentlessly, accompanied by phenomena that suggested the very fabric of reality was being manipulated by forces beyond her comprehension. The creatures seemed to possess abilities that went beyond simple physical prowess, as if they could influence the environment itself to aid in their hunt. Emma's terror reached new heights when she realized that her pursuers seemed to be enjoying the chase, their calls carrying what could only be described as amusement, as if her panic was providing them with entertainment rather than simply serving a practical purpose. The creatures appeared to be toying with her, allowing her to think she was escaping, only to cut off her route and force her to change direction. Their superior knowledge of the terrain gave them an overwhelming advantage, and Emma began to understand that her flight was nothing more than another part of their experiment, a test of her responses under extreme stress rather than a genuine opportunity for freedom. The psychological warfare was as deliberate as their physical pursuit, designed to break down her resistance and force her into complete submission. At one point during the chase, Emma managed to climb a massive fallen tree that had created a natural bridge across a deep ravine, hoping to put some distance between herself and her pursuers. But as she reached the middle of the makeshift bridge, she heard the unmistakable sound of the creatures climbing up behind her with impossible agility. Their massive hands gripped the bark with ease, their powerful limbs propelling them up the trunk with a speed that defied their enormous size. Emma could hear their breathing growing closer, deep and rhythmic, like the sound of massive bellows. And she realized with growing horror that they were actually gaining on her, despite her head start. The creature's pursuit took on an almost playful quality, as they began to demonstrate abilities that seemed designed to showcase their superiority over their human prey. Emma watched in terror as one of the beings leaped from tree to tree with impossible grace, covering distances that should have been fatal for any creature of its size. Another seemed to be moving through the forest canopy above her, keeping pace with her desperate flight while remaining almost completely invisible among the dense foliage. The coordination between the creatures was so precise that Emma began to suspect they were communicating through methods she couldn't detect, perhaps using infrasonic frequencies or other signals that were beyond human perception. As Emma's energy waned, she stumbled into a clearing she didn't recognize, one that seemed impossibly ancient, the ground covered in spirals of stones and bones. The air was thick with the scent of moss and something musky, and the trees pressed in so tightly that the sky was only a memory. The creatures paused at the edge, watching her with a patience that felt almost ritualistic. For a moment, Emma felt as if she were the centerpiece of a ceremony, the subject of a gathering that had been waiting for her arrival for centuries. The largest of the beings stepped forward, raising its arms and letting out a guttural call that echoed through the trees, answered by the others in a chorus that made the ground vibrate beneath her feet. Suddenly, the spell was broken. The creatures turned and melted back into the forest, leaving Emma alone in the clearing. She didn't know if she had passed some kind of test or if they had simply lost interest, but she seized the opportunity to run. Branches whipped at her face and roots threatened to trip her with every step, but she pushed on, driven by a primal fear that drowned out all rational thought. Behind her, she could still hear the creatures moving, their calls growing fainter as she put distance between them. But even as she escaped, Emma knew the forest was still watching, and that whatever had happened in that clearing was only the beginning of a mystery that would haunt her for the rest of her life. The breakthrough that would save Emma's life came when she stumbled into an area where her cell phone unexpectedly picked up a weak signal, allowing her to place a frantic call to emergency services while still running from her pursuers. The 911 recording captured her panicked description of being chased by creatures that defied rational explanation, beings that moved through the forest with intelligence and coordination that suggested advanced cognitive abilities. Her call was interrupted by sounds that the emergency operator later described as unlike anything in their experience. Vocalizations that seemed to come from multiple sources and carried an unmistakable sense of intelligence and purpose. The creatures seemed to realize what she was doing and began calling to each other with increased urgency, as if debating whether to stop her communication or allow it to continue. Emma's call ended abruptly when her phone lost signal, but not before emergency responders had obtained her GPS coordinates and a recording that would become the subject of intense analysis and debate. The creatures pursuing her seemed to realize that outside help was coming, and their vocalizations took on a different quality, less playful and more urgent, as if they were debating whether to continue their pursuit or retreat deeper into the forest. Emma could hear them calling to each other in what sounded like rapid consultation, their massive forms still crashing through the trees behind her, but with less coordination than before. The change in their behavior suggested that they understood the implications of human authorities becoming involved in their activities. The sound of approaching helicopters seemed to trigger a fundamental change in the creatures' behavior, their pursuit becoming less aggressive as they apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor. Emma could still hear them moving through the forest around her, but they were no longer actively hurting her or trying to cut off her escape routes. Instead, they seemed to be withdrawing deeper into the wilderness, their vocalizations fading as they put distance between themselves and the approaching rescue operation. Emma's relief was tempered by the realization that her ordeal was far from over. She was still lost in a vast wilderness with creatures that could return at any moment if they decided the threat had passed. The creatures' withdrawal was not immediate or complete, as Emma continued to hear them moving through the forest around her for several more hours. They seemed to be maintaining surveillance of her position while staying far enough away to avoid detection by the search teams. Their vocalizations became more subdued but never stopped entirely, suggesting that they were continuing to communicate about her presence and the arrival of outside help. Emma had the disturbing realization that she was still being watched and evaluated, even as rescue teams worked to locate her position. The creature's ability to remain hidden while maintaining awareness of the situation demonstrated a level of tactical sophistication that was deeply unsettling. As the search helicopters grew closer, Emma began to notice changes in the forest around her that suggested the creatures were actively working to conceal evidence of their presence. Footprints that had been clearly visible just hours before seemed to be disappearing, as if someone was deliberately obscuring the tracks. Equipment that had been scattered during her flight was being moved or hidden, and the paths through the forest that had seemed so clear during the chase were becoming increasingly difficult to follow. The creatures appeared to be conducting a systematic cleanup operation, removing any evidence that might confirm Emma's incredible story about what had happened in the wilderness. The search and rescue operation that followed Emma's emergency call revealed evidence that supported her incredible claims while raising new questions about what had actually occurred in those remote mountains. Rangers found massive footprints throughout the area where Emma had been chased, tracks that formed complex patterns suggesting coordinated movement by multiple large beings. Her camera equipment was discovered scattered throughout the forest, positioned in ways that suggested deliberate placement rather than random dropping, with memory cards that contained hours of footage showing glimpses of enormous figures moving through the trees with obvious intelligence and purpose. The equipment had been handled with care, as if the creatures understood its value and had deliberately preserved it for discovery. The footage recovered from Emma's cameras provided the most compelling evidence ever captured of intelligent non-human life in North American forests, showing clear images of bipedal creatures that stood over 8 feet tall and moved with coordination that indicated advanced cognitive abilities. The beings appeared to be deliberately positioning themselves to be recorded, as if they wanted their existence to be documented, but only under circumstances of their own choosing. Most remarkably, some sequences showed the creatures using what appeared to be primitive tools and communicating with each other, through complex vocalizations that suggested a sophisticated language system. The footage also captured moments where the creatures seemed to be studying Emma's equipment with obvious scientific interest, manipulating her devices with a dexterity that suggested hands capable of fine motor control. Analysis of the recovered footage revealed details that investigators found deeply unsettling, particularly the way the creatures seemed to be conducting their own documentation of Emma's behavior and responses. Several sequences showed the beings using what appeared to be primitive recording devices of their own, crude but functional tools that suggested they were gathering their own evidence of the encounter for purposes that remained completely mysterious. The creatures' behavior indicated not just intelligence, but also scientific curiosity, as if they were conducting their own research project with Emma as the unwilling subject. Most disturbing was the discovery that some of the footage had been edited or altered in ways that suggested the creatures possessed technical knowledge that exceeded what should have been possible for beings living in the wilderness. Emma was found 12 hours after her emergency call, discovered by search teams following the trail of broken vegetation and scattered equipment that marked her desperate flight through the forest. She was dehydrated and exhausted, but physically unharmed, though her mental state suggested she had experienced trauma that went far beyond simple fear of wild animals. Her account of being chased by multiple intelligent creatures was initially met with skepticism, but the physical evidence and recorded footage forced investigators to take her claims seriously. Most puzzling was her insistence that the creatures had deliberately allowed her to escape once they realized that outside help was coming, suggesting that their intelligence extended to understanding the broader implications of their actions. The evidence left behind after Emma's escape, strange tool marks, massive coordinated footprints, and her haunting footage, forced even the most skeptical rangers to admit she had encountered something far beyond a wild animal. The area was quietly restricted, and rumors spread of a hidden society in the forest. But Emma's story remained the only first-hand account. Her experience stands as a chilling warning. Some mysteries in the wild are not meant to be solved, and the silence of the forest may be watching, waiting for the next intruder. It was October 12, 2019, in the fog-heavy foothills near Willow Creek, where sound drifted without direction and the forest felt unnervingly aware. Sam Quinn's car was found locked at the trailhead, her pack untouched inside, but her recorder missing. When searchers recovered it 2 days later under mud, it held 5 files capturing hours of movement and something else. Something that had followed her with practiced familiarity. Something she had been meeting for nearly a year. The recordings documented patterns she believed were mutual, exchanges she thought were reciprocal, and a presence that had learned exactly how close it could get. Her notes traced the origins back to late November 2018. She never saw him, but she heard the same pattern behind her on nearly every visit. 3 steps, a pause, 3 more, always 20 to 25 feet back, never closer unless she initiated it. Then objects began to appear, stones arranged, bark placed neatly, only after she started leaving items of her own. She recorded each exchange as part of a growing, deliberate pattern. What changed over the following months was not the scatter of objects, but the precision behind them. Stones she placed were sometimes returned in symmetrical patterns or arranged into small arcs as if following the curvature of her original placements. Lines of bark shavings appeared in narrow columns that matched the width of her footprints. It was not random, it was not chaotic. Each adjustment was subtle enough to be overlooked by anyone unfamiliar with the terrain, but clear enough to her, someone who spent hours in each clearing, to recognize intention. The pacing never varied. It remained the anchor of every visit, holding the same distance even as she changed elevation. The presence never approached without cause. It never pushed past its invisible boundary unless she initiated an offering ritual, and even then, it moved with deliberate silence. Her logs described that silence in detail, not an absence of noise, but a muted shift of weight, accompanied by dense compression of the forest floor. She wrote that the sound carried a heaviness no human could replicate without equipment. But she did not treat it as threat. She treated it as recognition. By late winter, the ridge had become less of a field site and more of a place she believed she was expected to return to. She scheduled her visits around dusk, noting that the presence never responded with the same consistency during morning or midday hours. She began arranging her offerings more carefully, never leaving them in random locations, always placing them on bare patches of soil free of debris, as if presenting them for clear visibility. After several months, she found that offerings left slightly off-center were later repositioned into alignment with a nearby log or stump, reinforcing her sense that the presence wanted clarity in how these exchanges were conducted. Her notes shifted subtly throughout spring. She stopped referring to the presence as it in certain entries and instead used nonspecific masculine pronouns without directly explaining why. She wrote that some evenings felt guided, that certain knock patterns seemed to precede her movement into specific sections of the ridge. A 3-knock sequence would echo from uphill, and she often interpreted that pattern as permission to continue forward. When she paused, the pacing paused. When she turned, it turned. When she rested, it held position. She did not frame this as surveillance. She framed it as synchronized travel, 2 beings navigating a shared route according to an unspoken structure. She described a moment in June when she sat on a fallen spruce and remained motionless for nearly 20 minutes, recording atmosphere rather than movement. The presence did not leave. It paced along the perimeter of the clearing in slow, deliberate arcs, adjusting its distance only when she shifted her posture. She wrote that she felt watched, not the predatory kind of watching, but an attention that held her in a steady, assessing posture. In her entries, she noted that such moments felt less like study and more like acknowledgement, as if the presence recognized her stillness as part of their communication. Patterns deepened further when she began leaving warm objects, cloth warmed by body heat or jars heated in her pack beneath a jacket. These were always retrieved and on several occasions left in new positions by the next visit. Once she found a piece of bark folded over one of her cloths, creating a small enclosed pocket. She took this as evidence of understanding, though analysts later interpreted it as opportunistic manipulation of material. But Sam contextualized it as nuanced reciprocity. Her interpretations shaped every subsequent visit. She believed the presence was adapting to her, learning from her, responding with its own form of structured behavior. Seasonal rhythms continued to tighten the predictability of their interactions. She wrote that certain locations always initiated pacing, others elicited knocks, and others remained quiet, regardless of how long she waited. She mapped these territories in her notes, labeling some areas as permitted zones and others as restricted. She never clarified how she determined these boundaries, only that attempts to enter specific regions always produced distant vocalizations or heavy branch snaps that signaled limitation. She did not register these as warnings. She registered them as rules in an ongoing relationship she was learning to understand. As summer progressed, the interactions grew more layered. The presence began mirroring not only her footsteps, but her breathing patterns. In a late July entry, she described slowing her exhale intentionally to test whether the pacing adjusted. It did. The breathing she recorded from the tree line became more rhythmically controlled, rising and falling in intervals that nearly matched her own. She believed the presence monitored not just her movement, but her state. This reinforced her sense of personal connection. She framed these interactions as trust-building, as if the presence viewed her stillness and calm as signals that reinforced mutual recognition. Her last complete journal entry, dated September 28th, documented a moment where she found a narrow stretch of ground cleared in a clean, straight line at the edge of a ridge she rarely crossed. The clearing matched the size and shape of a walkway, its edges marked by snapped twigs arranged in parallel rows. She interpreted this as an invitation, an opening carved into terrain previously avoided. She wrote that she had never seen this pattern before and that it felt like a route meant specifically for her. Analysts would later suggest it could have been the result of natural debris sliding downslope after a storm, but Sam perceived meaning in the arrangement. It aligned with her belief that the presence had begun guiding her more intentionally. All of this led into the night of October 12th, when the first recovered audio file began. Light was fading as Sam's footsteps moved through the familiar trail leading into the ridge. Her breathing remained slow, steady, and unhurried. 20 seconds into the recording, the familiar rhythm began behind her, the same measured pattern recorded through nearly a year of interactions. There was no surprise in her breathing. She did not stop or hesitate. She continued at a measured pace, as if expecting the presence to follow. The first file documented more than proximity. It documented confirmation. When she initiated a 3-knock sequence on a nearby trunk, the answering knock echoed from uphill shortly after. The tone was deeper than previous recordings, resonant enough to vibrate through the forest floor. She paused briefly, not out of caution but interpretation. The pattern she heard aligned with earlier exchanges she categorized as acknowledgement. She moved forward after the knock ended, stepping toward a brush cluster, where she knelt and placed an object on soil. The presence retrieved it with sudden efficiency. No buildup, no rustling approach, just immediate repositioning into the space she vacated. She rose and began walking again. The rhythm resumed in perfect synchrony. Her breathing did not shift. She interpreted the retrieval as acceptance, a continuation of a ritual repeated many times before. The recording captured her steadiness as she moved, pausing only when she reached a clearing where she found a deep soil impression. She knelt and traced the edges with her fingers. The presence remained behind her, breathing heavily, but not approaching. Its stillness during her examination, so long as she maintained calm posture. The final sound in File 1 was her goodbye pattern. 3 deliberate knocks. The expected answering knock never came. The silence that followed marked the first deviation from the ritual she relied upon. Silence settled where an expected reply should have been. The absence felt oddly intimate, like a held breath that had nowhere to go. Sam waited the customary few seconds, then counted in her head, then waited longer. The pattern she trusted had unraveled in a single gap. She logged the moment later as a deviation she could study instead of a sign to retreat. She rose, smoothed her jacket, and continued. The pacing returned, but with small adjustments she could not yet interpret. Pauses elongated, intervals shifted by fractions of a beat, and some knocks that once answered her came delayed or from different bearings. As the evening deepened, those micro differences accumulated into a new texture of expectation. Sam recorded each alteration with clinical attention, measuring the time between her knock and any response, noting wind direction, humidity, and the way light bled through the canopy. She cataloged anomalies the way a scientist logs aberrant readings, convinced that mapping the changes would reveal intent. In her notes, anomalies were problems to be solved, not warnings to be obeyed. The presence that had once mirrored her pace now sometimes moved ahead, stopping in small clearings and waiting. A knock sequence would originate from a direction she had not approached before. She wrote these changes down and, crucially, she followed. Where once she had retreated from new noises, now she saw them as extensions of the system they had developed together. The feeling such decisions produced was complex, equal parts curiosity, and the brittle confidence that comes from repeated success. Small reciprocations continued to thread through these uneasy shifts. Warm jars she left were still taken more often than other items. On 2 mornings, she returned to find bark, folded in a way that suggested deliberate handling rather than accidental movement. Once a ribbon she tied to a low branch had been slid a foot along the stem and tucked into a crook, as if repositioned to be more visible to her next arrival. Those gestures reinforced the idea that the presence engaged selectively with what she offered. Each selective response tightened the logic in her head. Give this, receive that. Observe that, receive attention. The exchange loop had become a grammar, and she had learned to read it. At the same time, other behaviors grew less hospitable. Branch snaps increased on the edges of trails she did not usually take. Low guttural tones, longer and more structured than the brief rhythms she had cataloged before, rippled through narrow gullies at times she had never recorded them. These sounds were not simple knocks or pacing, they were low-resonance signals that vibrated through rock and soil. She recorded and noted them, annotating their duration and the positions from which they emerged. Analysts later would call these signals boundary markers, acoustic fences designed to delineate access. To Sam, they were temporal markers, cues she believed would help her anticipate safer routes. Her conviction that she belonged in the pattern hardened in part because of the way the presence sometimes accommodated her in almost human-like ways. On one dusk, she stepped into a shallow hollow to untie a bootlace. The pacing slowed, settling into a steady orbit at a distance closer than usual. She felt watched, but not menaced. When she rose and continued, the rhythm warmed into a more patient tempo, and a single stone she had left days earlier appeared nudged closer to her footpath the following dawn. She logged the gesture as an act of attention. These small allowances only reinforced her belief that their interactions had entered a new stage she wasn't meant to question. This idea of being chosen carried weight. It influenced her choices outwardly and inwardly. She began prioritizing the ridge above other obligations in her notes. Entries documented adjusted work schedules, late evening returns, and canceled day trips in favor of nights when the rhythm of the forest felt most communicative. The relationship she had built through repetition was not romantic in tone, but it was personal. She felt recognized by an intelligence that tracked her patterns and sometimes adapted. The familiarity insulated her from doubt, even as the forest's signals grew more complex. The lines of permission tightened into lines of control. She noticed this most in the way her own movement started to resemble obedience rather than collaboration. Prior to that season, she had wandered freely across moss beds and low ridge lines. Later, she found herself checking the angle of light, feeling for the faint undercurrent of pacing that would tell her whether she should continue. When the pacing paused ahead of her, she took it as direction to proceed. When it quickened just behind, she slowed, assuming instruction. In cases where she hesitated, the pattern sometimes reverted to harsher markers, branches breaking with decisive force, vocalizations that carried a sharper edge. Each time she experienced a harsher marker, she logged it as a lesson rather than a deterrent, and then she adjusted her behavior to conform. An important turning point arrived in early October with the discovery of a narrow corridor she had not used before. The passage sliced through an area of dense growth into a shallow bowl, the floor of which was pressed flat, as if a large form had lain there repeatedly. She documented the depression, its moisture content, and the pressure gradients in the surrounding soil. But in the margin, she wrote a single line that betrayed her core belief. He had prepared this place. The entry was both methodical and intimate. Following the corridor felt to her like following an invitation, and when she traced the path beneath the birches, she felt, briefly, less alone than on any trail she had known. As the night shortened, the presence's behavior reflected increased insistence. Knocks that once waited for her now came with a cadence that led rather than followed. She interpreted this as escalation toward deeper trust, the opening of thresholds she had not seen before. That confidence is fragile when based on repeated tolerances. It becomes dangerous if the tolerances are conditional. The first clear fracture occurred not with a violent act, but with a pattern of silence and substitution. One evening, after she left an offering in a small clearing where they often exchanged items, she waited for the expected knock. None came. Instead, she found the offering later shifted to the edge of the clearing and partially covered with a flat piece of bark. The move was precise, almost ceremonial, but it occurred beyond the habitual exchange window and with a slowness that suggested deliberation rather than routine. She recorded the change in detail and labeled it peculiarity rather than alarm. The substitution felt purposeful, She read it as meaningful, possibly indicative of wanting her to approach a little differently. Analysts later labeled such substitutions as markers of altered tolerance, behavioral edits, indicating revised rules. Her interpretations hardened when the presence began to match, in one recorded instance, the rhythm of her breathing so closely that she described the sensation as reciprocal attunement. She kept that note like evidence, a moment where their rates moved in near-perfect alignment. For her, it was proof of connection. For others, it suggested a predator skilled at mimicking to remove her anxiety. Her conviction did not abate. She doubled down on rituals. More precise placement, warmer offerings, measured pauses, and timed knocks meant to test expectancy. The rituals felt like language, and she believed she had learned to speak with him. That belief carried her to the night when sounds led her down into the less-known ridgeline. The calls, if they were calls, came from above and below, from a sequence of knocks that suggested a route carved into the heart of the ridge. She followed the procession of responses deeper than she had ever been, trusting that accumulated reciprocations were proof of continued mutual recognition. The path narrowed. Branches overhead knit into a low tunnel. Echoes grew tight and close. The rhythm of the presence sped and slowed with a precision she read as choreography. At several points, she noted a tightening in her chest on the recordings, a physiological response that had rarely accompanied her outings. Her breath clipped, not with panic, but with acute concentration. She told herself the sensation was part of the exchange, an element of attentiveness she had not felt before. The forest around her gained density, not just of foliage, but of intent. Objects she had left behind earlier were occasionally visible in peripheral glints of moonlight, repositioned in ways that emphasized a path rather than a mere acknowledgement. Then, in the quiet between two knocks, she heard a change in the ambient soundscape, a drawn-out inhale so close that it produced a faint, warm pressure on the microphone. It was the audible intake of breath she had cataloged before, but never so near. Her own breathing slowed reflexively. The kinesthetic response that had once been part of mutual regulation now teetered into a more dangerous intimacy. The recorded inhale halted. Silence ensued. Thicker this time, as if expectation itself had been folded into the underbrush. The absence was not empty. It held the weight of deliberate attention. She moved forward. The next sequence of sounds was unlike any she had previously documented. Branches collapsed in controlled bursts ahead, then behind. Knocks that had guided shifted to knocks that corralled. The presence no longer mirrored or permitted, it directed and limited. It funneled her into a descending corridor of stone and wet soil where the echo compressed into a single, low vibration. She advanced because every lesson she had learned taught her to follow. She advanced because she believed the bond meant being shown. This is where the pattern she had lived within changed irreversibly. The steps that once signified welcome became the metrics of containment. The rhythm that suggested companionship revealed itself as an architecture of dominance. The choices she had made, born of repeated reciprocities, had led her past the point where tolerance translated into permission. The recording devices would capture what followed. Sam could not foresee, inside the rhythm that had been her guide, the exact moment the geometry of relationship would turn to something else. The moment the rhythm turned from familiar to directive, Sam's footing shifted from confidence to strained obedience. Her recorder picked up shallow breaths as she slowed to interpret the new sequence of knocks. 3 grouped impacts ahead of her, 1 behind, then a long pause. She had never documented this pattern, but she treated it as a new piece of the language she believed they shared. Where others might have frozen, she stepped forward, trusting the structure that had always led her deeper rather than harmed her. The ridge constricted around her in ways she had not mapped. Dense ferns pulled inward like curtains. Fallen limbs formed narrow channels that forced her through pockets of chilled air. Each time she hesitated, a heavy footfall landed just off to her left or right, nudging her onward without touching her. She interpreted these as assurances, gentle corrections rather than warnings. Her understanding was shaped by months of mutual pacing, mirrored rhythms, and tolerated closeness. She did not yet realize that tolerance had been conditional. The slope steepened as she descended. Loose shale crackled under her boots, sending small landslides of grit down the incline. The presence followed with measured confidence, navigating terrain that forced her to use both hands for stability. What had once been consistent distance compressed into inconsistent intervals, sometimes 10 feet, sometimes closer. A single exhale drifted over the microphone at one point, heated enough to register as a faint distortion. She paused, absorbing the breath as if it were a sign of recognition, not dominance. When she resumed moving, the pacing shifted again. It no longer accompanied her. It controlled her path. Heavy impacts landed at intersections she might have taken, blocking turns she had used during previous visits. The forest itself seemed rearranged, the familiar trail markers swallowed by disorderly brush, new openings appearing where none had existed weeks earlier. She cataloged these differences in her head, believing she was being guided through a new route meant only for her. The possibility that the route existed for reasons separate from her did not occur to her inside the framework she had built. As she approached a natural alcove shaped by sloping stone, the sounds around her stiffened. Branches broke at precise heights, forming a lattice around the narrow entrance. Something large moved through brush with complex intent, closing distance in some places while withdrawing in others, creating an acoustic perimeter she mistook for protection. She crouched, adjusting her pack straps, and the presence mirrored her shift with a low, resonant inhale that filled the recorder. She believed it acknowledged her pause. Inside the alcove, she found a stretch of flattened earth bordered by fresh breaks in saplings. The soil bore multiple compressions, none distinctly human. She knelt, touching the depressions as she always did, tracing the edges with slow, respectful movements. Her breathing slowed, her posture relaxed. The presence stayed close enough for its breathing to obscure wind noise, but it did not enter the alcove while she examined the ground. She interpreted this restraint as deference. When she stood again, she offered another warm object, pulling it from the inner pocket of her coat. The recorder caught the soft rustle as she placed it on the soil, then stepped back, 10 measured paces, exactly as ritual demanded. She waited for a retrieval sound. For the first time that night, nothing moved. Silence pulsed through the alcove. The absence of retrieval felt like a withheld response rather than a denial. Sam stepped forward a single pace, confused but not alarmed. The next sound arrived with abrupt, decisive weight, a heavy step landing closer than any she had ever recorded. Soil shifted under immense pressure. A moment later, the offering vanished with a single motion, not the smooth lifting she had grown accustomed to, but a rapid, forceful removal. She steadied herself, interpreting the suddenness as urgency within the ritual, rather than a breaking of it. This misinterpretation carried her deeper into the ridge. When she emerged from the alcove, the forest tightened around her. The knock sequences changed position rapidly, one ahead, one behind, one far to the right. She pivoted toward the sequence she believed indicated direction. Immediately, a large mass moved parallel to her, crashing through brush with deliberate speed. The recorder captured the overlap of footfalls, one directly behind at close range, another repositioning along the slope. What mattered was that Sam interpreted all movement as part of the same relationship she believed she had built. Her breathing grew unsteady as she descended onto unstable ground. Water pooled across the corridor floor, turning soil into slick patches that forced her to brace against the rock walls. The presence entered the water seconds later, heavy splashes confirming its commitment to the path she followed. She turned right, thinking the pool narrowed there, and the footsteps cut her off, repositioning ahead with startling precision. The recorder caught the faint sound of her gear shifting as she halted abruptly. She believed the presence was guiding her away from danger. She did not understand that she had been removed from her options. Farther down the corridor, the forest erupted. Branches cracked above her, far higher than a person could reach, then snapped again at her flank, then behind. These were not random collapses. Each break sounded calculated, placed to form an audible boundary. Sam crouched, waiting for the rhythm to reassemble into something she could read. The knocks resumed, low and slow, from directly ahead. She interpreted them as reassurance. She pushed deeper. The terrain ahead forced her into a bottleneck between two leaning slabs of rock. The recorder captured the scraping of her jacket against stone. The presence entered behind her, compressing the space with its bulk. Water splashed under its steps. She increased her pace, boots sinking into mud that sucked at her heels. Several times she stumbled, but recovered, leaning against the corridor walls. She was still trying to follow the language she had trusted for nearly a year. The next sounds on the recorder signaled the collapse of that language. A trunk split ahead of her, an instantaneous break, not the slow splinter of natural fall. Soil rumbled as a large mass repositioned faster than she could react. She stepped back, then forward, uncertain which route remained open. The presence moved into the remaining space with a series of short, powerful impacts. Then came the moment she could not interpret. A warm gust of air hit the microphone, closer than any previous breath. It carried moisture and heat, distorting the mesh cover. Her inhalation followed, sharp, involuntary. The recorder documented her weight shifting onto gravel, her boots skidding. She tried to steady herself. The presence's breathing thickened into a rush of air. The impact followed. The recorder captured it as a blunt, resonant collision, mass meeting bone, or fabric, or both. Gear rattled violently. Something slid. The device tumbled, scraping across stone and dirt. It rolled, bounced, then landed against moss or soft soil. The microphone angle shifted, but continued recording. No human breath followed. Instead, there was dragging, heavy, rhythmic, unhurried. Soil compressed beneath repeated pulls. Branches snapped under weight. The sound receded along a downward slope before vanishing under rainfall and wind. Sam Quinn's presence vanished into that sound. The recorder remained, capturing the forest as it returned to equilibrium. Rain thickening, leaves adjusting, nocturnal movement resuming hesitantly. The ridge swallowed what had been taken, leaving only the mechanical persistence of a device running until its battery died. Searchers recovered the recorder, a torn strap, and one oversized track pressed deep into soil. Drag impressions led downslope before fading on hard shale. Dogs refused the deeper ridge, and thermal scans revealed nothing. No remains were found. The case was listed as missing, presumed deceased. All that survived were the recordings. Months of patterns Sam believed were mutual, ending in a final sequence where the connection she trusted tightened into control. In the end, the recording showed that the bond she believed she was building became real only when he acted on it, claiming her the moment she stepped too deep into his territory. When he first ventured into the Cascade Mountains in 1947, as if they'd chosen him specifically for reasons he would never fully understand. From his first night in the wilderness, massive shapes had surrounded his camp, beings that stood nearly 9 feet tall and moved with an intelligence that was unmistakably predatory. They hadn't attacked him, but they'd made their intentions clear through gestures and vocalizations that carried an unmistakable message. He belonged to them now. The creatures had herded him deeper into the wilderness, away from any hope of rescue, to a place where human rules no longer applied, and their ancient laws governed every aspect of existence. The beings Thomas came to know as his captors operated according to a social structure that was both primitive and sophisticated, with hierarchies based on size, age, and something he could only describe as psychic dominance. The largest among them, a massive patriarch that Thomas privately called the Elder, seemed to possess an intelligence that rivaled human cognition while remaining utterly alien in its motivations. This creature had claimed Thomas as a prize, a living specimen to be studied, used, and ultimately broken through decades of psychological manipulation that would leave scars deeper than any physical wound. Thomas's daily existence became a carefully orchestrated routine of servitude and observation, with the creatures using him as both a tool and an experiment in human endurance. They forced him to build structures using techniques they demonstrated through intimidation and violence, construction methods that required him to work alongside beings whose strength could crush him without effort. The cabin that would later puzzle investigators had been built under constant supervision, with Thomas serving as the architect while his captors provided the impossible physical labor that no human could have accomplished alone. When he attempted to resist their demands, they would withhold food for days, leaving him weak and compliant. The creature's interest in Thomas went beyond simple curiosity about human behavior. They seemed to be conducting a long-term study of human adaptation under extreme psychological pressure. They would disappear for days at a time, leaving him alone with the illusion of freedom, only to return when he began to hope for escape. These psychological games became more sophisticated over the years, with the beings learning to manipulate his emotions and responses with a precision that suggested they understood human psychology better than most humans did themselves. They would allow him brief glimpses of the outside world, forcing him to make supervised trips to town for supplies, always with the unspoken threat that any attempt to seek help would result in consequences too terrible to imagine. The first reports of unusual activity around Thomas's property began surfacing in the early 1950s, when loggers working nearby claims started describing encounters that made them question their sobriety. They spoke of massive shapes moving through the trees at dawn, sounds that resembled human conversation, but in voices too deep and resonant to belong to any person. Equipment would be moved overnight, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose rather than random animal interference. Most disturbing were the gifts, carved wooden objects and arrangements of stones that appeared near their camps, crafted with a skill that implied hands far larger than human, but possessing an artistic sensibility that seemed designed to mock human attempts at creativity. The creature's communication with Thomas evolved from simple gestures to a complex system of sounds and symbols that he was forced to learn under threat of starvation or violence. They seemed fascinated by human language, often forcing him to repeat words and phrases while they attempted to mimic the sounds with vocal cords that weren't designed for human speech. These sessions would last for hours, with Thomas serving as an unwilling teacher in a classroom where failure to cooperate resulted in punishment that left him broken and terrified. Food became a weapon of control, with the creatures providing sustenance that kept Thomas alive, but dependent on their generosity. They would bring him fruits, vegetables, and nuts, gathered from locations he could never find on his own, always in quantities that reminded him of his helplessness. When he attempted to hunt or forage independently, they would sabotage his efforts, destroying his traps and scaring away game until he learned that survival depended entirely on their whims. His supervised shopping trips to town reflected this forced diet: massive amounts of raw vegetables, fruits, and nuts, but very little meat or processed food, creating a shopping pattern that puzzled store owners. The transformation in Thomas's appearance over the years became a source of whispered speculation among the few locals who encountered him during his rare, supervised visits to town. By the 1960s, something had changed in fundamental ways that went beyond simple aging. His posture had become more upright and confident, his movements more fluid and purposeful, but there was something broken in his eyes that suggested a man who had learned to survive by surrendering his humanity piece by piece. His hands had grown larger and more powerful from the constant manual labor the creatures demanded, while his vocal patterns had changed to incorporate sounds that seemed designed to communicate with his captors. As the years passed, Thomas began to understand that he wasn't the first human the creatures had captured. Evidence throughout their territory suggested a long history of contact with people who had ventured too deep into the wilderness and never returned. Personal belongings from missing hikers and campers were displayed like trophies in hidden caves, arranged with a care that suggested the creatures valued these remnants of their previous captives. The implications were horrifying. Thomas was part of a pattern that stretched back generations, a tradition of human collection that the creatures had refined over decades of practice. The creatures' treatment of Thomas became more sophisticated as they learned to exploit his psychological vulnerabilities with surgical precision. They would withhold social contact for weeks at a time, leaving him in complete isolation until he began to crave even their alien presence. When they finally returned, Thomas would find himself grateful for their attention, a response that horrified him even as he found himself unable to resist the conditioning they had imposed through decades of careful manipulation. Physical changes in Thomas became more pronounced as the years of captivity took their toll on his body and mind. His hands grew larger and more powerful from the constant manual labor the creatures demanded, while his posture adapted to walking alongside beings whose stride length was nearly twice his own. Most disturbing was the way his vocal patterns began to incorporate sounds and frequencies that seemed designed to communicate with his captors, as if his very humanity was being slowly eroded by prolonged exposure to their alien influence. The creature's interest in human reproduction became apparent when they began bringing Thomas into contact with other captives, women who had been taken from hiking trails and camping sites across the Pacific Northwest. These encounters were brief and traumatic, with Thomas realizing that the creatures were attempting to breed humans like livestock, studying the results of their experiments with a clinical detachment that revealed the true depth of their alien nature. The fate of these women and any children that might have resulted from these forced encounters remained a mystery that would haunt Thomas for the rest of his life. Government interest in the creature's territory began in the late 1970s when satellite imagery revealed anomalies that couldn't be explained by conventional analysis. The forest around Thomas's prison showed patterns of growth and development that suggested systematic cultivation, with clearings arranged in geometric shapes that appeared too regular to be natural. Thermal imaging detected heat signatures that indicated a population far larger than one hermit could account for, with movement patterns that suggested a community living according to organized social structures. The creatures seemed aware of this increased government attention, becoming more cautious in their movements and more aggressive in their control of Thomas. They began forcing him to help them develop countermeasures against human technology, using his knowledge of electronics and communication systems to create interference patterns that would confuse government monitoring equipment. Thomas found himself trapped between his desire to escape and his terror of what the creatures would do to him if they discovered any attempt at betrayal. Intelligence agencies had been quietly monitoring the region since the early days of the Cold War, initially suspecting that Thomas might be involved in espionage or illegal weapons development. Surveillance teams reported encounters that challenged their training and experience, describing beings of enormous size that moved through the forest with intelligence and purpose that defied classification as wildlife. These creatures seemed aware of the surveillance efforts and would occasionally leave messages for the watchers, arrangements of stones and branches that conveyed meaning through symbolism that no government analyst could decode. The decision to investigate Thomas's property came after decades of accumulating evidence that something unprecedented was occurring in those remote mountains. Intelligence agencies had been monitoring reports of unusual activity in the region since the 1950s, documenting encounters that followed patterns too consistent to dismiss as folklore or misidentification. Witnesses described beings of enormous size and obvious intelligence, living in organized communities that operated according to social structures that predated human civilization. The planning for the raid involved multiple agencies and months of preparation as officials struggled to develop protocols for a situation that had no precedent in law enforcement history. Psychological profiles of Thomas suggested a man who had undergone fundamental changes that went beyond normal human adaptation to wilderness living. Someone who might have developed loyalties that transcended national boundaries or even species identification, The final decision to proceed with the raid came from the highest levels of government, driven by concerns that Thomas's situation represented a potential security threat that could no longer be ignored. The creature's preparations for potential human contact revealed a level of strategic thinking that challenged everything Thomas thought he knew about their intelligence. They had been observing human society for generations, learning about military tactics, government operations, and technological capabilities through captured individuals like himself. Their hidden communities throughout the mountains were connected by communication networks that used natural acoustics to coordinate responses to any threat, with Thomas serving as both an intelligence asset and a potential bargaining chip. Thomas's role in the creature's society evolved from captive to reluctant collaborator as they began to rely on his knowledge of human psychology and behavior. They would consult him before making decisions that might affect their interactions with the outside world, treating him as an advisor while never allowing him to forget that his life depended entirely on their continued tolerance. This position gave him access to information about their long-term plans, including contingency strategies for dealing with government investigation and potential relocation to even more remote territories. The breakthrough that would eventually lead to Thomas's escape came when the creatures began experiencing internal conflicts over how to handle the increasing human presence in their territory. Younger members of their community advocated for more aggressive responses to government surveillance, while older individuals preferred the traditional approach of remaining hidden and avoiding contact. These disagreements created opportunities for Thomas to exploit as he began to understand the political dynamics that governed their society and the ways he might use their divisions to his advantage. The creature's decision to relocate deeper into the wilderness provided Thomas with the opportunity he had been waiting for decades to exploit. During the chaos of moving their entire community through underground tunnel systems, Thomas managed to slip away from his guards and begin the desperate journey back to human civilization. The escape took weeks, with Thomas navigating through terrain that had been deliberately altered to confuse and disorient anyone attempting to leave their territory without permission. He survived on roots and berries, avoiding the main trails where he knew the creatures would be searching for him, following streams and ridgelines that he hoped would eventually lead him back to the world he had been stolen from 40 years earlier. The physical toll of his escape nearly killed Thomas before he reached civilization, his body weakened by decades of captivity and the stress of his desperate flight through the wilderness. He had lost nearly 50 pounds by the time he stumbled out of the forest, his clothes hanging in tatters and his mind barely able to process the reality that he was finally free. The first humans he encountered, hikers on a popular trail, were so frightened by his appearance that they initially fled, thinking he was some kind of wild man or dangerous vagrant. It took hours of patient explanation before they agreed to help him reach the authorities. And even then, they seemed skeptical of his claims about what had happened to him in the mountains. Thomas's arrival at the FBI field office in Seattle marked the end of a nightmare that had consumed 40 years of his life, but also the beginning of a new kind of captivity as government agents struggled to process his incredible story. The physical evidence he provided, photographs, artifacts, and detailed maps of the creature's territory, corroborated his account in ways that forced investigators to confront the possibility that something unprecedented was living in the mountains of the Pacific Northwest. His detailed knowledge of government surveillance techniques and military tactics, information he could only have obtained through his forced cooperation with the creatures, convinced even the most skeptical agents that his story contained elements of truth that couldn't be dismissed. The morning of the raid, federal agents approached Thomas's abandoned cabin, expecting to find evidence that would either confirm or debunk his incredible claims. Instead, they discovered a property that challenged their understanding of what was possible for a single human being to accomplish under duress. The main cabin had been expanded over the years into a complex of interconnected structures, built with architectural techniques that seemed to blend human engineering with construction methods that appeared in no textbook. The buildings showed evidence of occupancy by beings of vastly different sizes, with doorways and furniture scaled for both human proportions and creatures that would have to stand nearly 9 feet tall. Inside the cabin, investigators found living spaces that told the story of captivity rather than voluntary cohabitation. Multiple sleeping areas had been constructed, some sized for human occupants and others clearly designed for much larger beings. The kitchen contained cooking implements and storage systems that could accommodate the dietary needs of Thomas's captors, with evidence of food preparation techniques that combined human methods with practices that seemed to originate from an entirely different culinary tradition. Most intriguing were the books and documents found throughout the property. Journals written in Thomas's handwriting, but containing symbols and languages that no linguist could identify, alongside what appeared to be maps of underground tunnel systems that extended for miles beneath the surrounding mountains. The search of Thomas's property revealed evidence of technological capabilities that the creatures had forced him to develop in their remote location. Solar panels and wind generators provided power for a sophisticated communication system that included radio equipment capable of reaching frequencies that weren't supposed to be accessible to civilian operators. Computer equipment, primitive by modern standards but advanced for its time, contained files that documented decades of observations about wildlife behavior, weather patterns, and geological activity in the region. But the most compelling discovery was a collection of photographs that showed Thomas in the company of beings that science insisted didn't exist. Massive, hair-covered humanoids that displayed obvious intelligence and what appeared to be complete dominance over their human captive. The photographic evidence found in Thomas's cabin documented a relationship that had evolved over decades, from initial capture to reluctant cooperation under duress. Early images showed Thomas as a younger man, clearly terrified and uncertain, standing at a considerable distance from massive figures that loomed threateningly in the shadows. Later photographs revealed growing submission and compliance, with Thomas eventually appearing in staged portraits alongside beings of various sizes, including what appeared to be juveniles and elderly individuals. The final photographs in the collection showed Thomas participating in ceremonies and activities that seemed to blend human and non-human traditions, suggesting that he had been forced to integrate into a society that operated according to rules unknown to the outside world. The basement of Thomas's cabin contained discoveries that would be classified by government agencies and never released to the public. Archaeological artifacts suggested that the area had been continuously inhabited for thousands of years, with evidence of a civilization that had developed along entirely different lines from human society. Tools and weapons showed craftsmanship that exceeded anything produced by known indigenous cultures, made from materials that didn't match the local geology and using techniques that seemed to require both enormous strength and incredible precision. Most disturbing were the human artifacts mixed among these alien objects, personal items that belonged to missing persons from across the Pacific Northwest, suggesting that Thomas's captors had been collecting humans from the outside world for generations. The investigation team's attempts to track the creatures' whereabouts led them deeper into the mountains, following trails that seemed to have been deliberately obscured but still showed signs of recent use by multiple large beings. The footprints they discovered matched those found around missing person cases dating back decades, but the patterns suggested organized hunting rather than random encounters. GPS equipment malfunctioned in certain areas, compasses spun wildly, and radio communication became impossible, as if the forest itself was actively interfering with their technology. Several team members reported feeling watched throughout their search, and motion-activated cameras they left behind captured images of massive shapes moving through the trees with an intelligence and purpose that challenged everything they thought they knew about wildlife behavior. The deeper the investigation team ventured into the wilderness, the more they encountered evidence of a sophisticated infrastructure that had been hidden beneath the forest canopy for generations. Ancient trails connected clearings that showed signs of regular use by large communities, with evidence of sustainable resource management that had maintained the forest's health while supporting a significant population of predators. Underground water systems had been engineered to provide clean drinking water throughout the territory, using techniques that seemed to work in harmony with natural hydrology rather than disrupting it. Most remarkably, the team discovered what appeared to be a communication network that used natural acoustics to carry messages across vast distances, with strategically placed rock formations that could amplify and direct sound waves through the mountains. The search for the creatures extended over several weeks, covering hundreds of square miles of wilderness that seemed to shift and change in ways that defied topographic maps. Helicopter overflights revealed structures hidden beneath the forest canopy, buildings that appeared to be constructed from living trees, shaped and guided rather than cut and assembled. These structures formed a network throughout the mountains, connected by paths that were invisible from ground level but clearly visible from above, suggesting a transportation system that had been developed over generations. The pilots reported equipment malfunctions when flying over certain areas, with instruments failing and engines running rough, as if something was actively discouraging aerial observation. The few witnesses who came forward during the investigation told stories that painted a picture of Thomas as a victim rather than a willing participant in whatever was happening in the mountains. Local indigenous elders spoke of him as someone who had been chosen against his will to serve as a bridge between worlds, forced to facilitate communication between human civilization and something that preferred to remain hidden while preying upon it. They described encounters with Thomas over the years, where he had appeared increasingly desperate and broken, serving as an unwilling translator and mediator in conflicts between their communities and the forest dwellers who had been there long before European settlement. The investigation took a dramatic turn when team members began experiencing encounters that challenged their understanding of what was possible in the modern world. Equipment would be moved overnight, arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and perhaps even mockery, as if unseen observers were demonstrating their superiority over the human searchers. Food supplies would disappear only to be replaced with wild edibles that had been prepared and arranged with obvious care and skill, but also with an undertone of threat that suggested the creatures could provide or withhold sustenance at will. Most unsettling were the sounds that echoed through the forest at night, vocalizations that resembled human speech, but in frequencies and patterns that suggested vocal cords far larger than any person possessed, carrying on conversations in languages that predated known human communication. The psychological effects on the investigation team became increasingly pronounced as their search continued, with several members reporting dreams and visions that seemed more real than waking life. These experiences always featured the same elements: vast underground cities carved from living rock, technologies that operated on principles beyond human understanding, and beings of enormous size and obvious intelligence who watched the searchers with expressions that conveyed both curiosity and predatory intent. Some team members began to question their mission, wondering whether they were investigating a threat to national security or walking into a trap that had been set by something far more intelligent than they had anticipated. The breakthrough in the case came when investigators discovered Thomas's personal journals, hidden in a cache that had been sealed with techniques that required both human intelligence and non-human strength to access. The journals documented 40 years of captivity with beings that Thomas referred to as the Old Ones, creatures that had inhabited the Pacific Northwest for millennia before human arrival. His entries described a gradual process of psychological breaking and forced adaptation, beginning with terrifying encounters and evolving into reluctant cooperation born of desperation and the will to survive. The journals revealed that Thomas had been chosen not randomly, but because of specific qualities that made him suitable for serving as an unwilling liaison between species that had been capturing humans from civilization for centuries. Thomas's writings described a society that operated according to principles that challenged human assumptions about intelligence, technology, and social organization. The beings he lived with had developed sustainable technologies that worked in harmony with natural systems, creating communities that could exist for generations without depleting their environment. But they used this knowledge to maintain their dominance over captured humans. They possessed knowledge of medicine, agriculture, and engineering that far exceeded human capabilities in some areas, while remaining deliberately primitive in others. Most remarkably, they had maintained detailed records of human development over centuries, watching and occasionally intervening in ways that had influenced the course of history without ever revealing their presence. The final entries in Thomas's journals, written during his desperate escape through the wilderness, revealed the true horror of his 4 decades in captivity and his growing realization that he might be the only human who had ever successfully escaped their control. He wrote about the impossible choice between remaining a captive and risking everything in an attempt to reach civilization, describing the terror of knowing that recapture would result in punishment worse than death. His final words spoke of a responsibility to warn humanity about the predators that lived in the shadows of civilization, beings that viewed humans as nothing more than specimens to be collected, studied, and ultimately consumed. The area around Thomas's former prison was quietly designated as a protected wilderness zone, with access restricted under environmental protection laws that were actually designed to prevent further contact with whatever lived in those mountains. Satellite monitoring of the region continues to this day, showing activity patterns that suggest the creatures are still there, still hunting, still collecting humans who venture too deep into their domain. Thomas remains in protective custody, his testimony classified at the highest levels of government, but his warnings about the predators that live in the wilderness have become part of the folklore whispered among those who understand that some secrets are too dangerous for civilization to acknowledge. The legacy of Thomas Garrett serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers that lurk in the spaces between the known and unknown, a reminder that humanity's dominance over the natural world may be nothing more than an illusion, maintained by creatures intelligent enough to remain hidden while they hunt. His 40 years of captivity revealed the existence of a predatory intelligence that has been operating in the shadows of human civilization for generations, collecting specimens and studying their prey with the patience of beings who measure time in centuries rather than years. The mountains remain quiet now, but those who know the truth understand that the silence is not empty. It's waiting for the next human to venture too deep into territories where ancient predators still claim dominion over all who enter their realm. Mark Halperin had chosen that bend in Hoh River for good reason. The current slowed there, creating a deep pool where bottom feeders like to congregate after dark. Mark had been fishing these waters for the better part of 15 years, ever since moving to Port Angeles for work. The first cast landed where the water deepened into a dark pool. The 80-pound braided line was overkill for most river fishing, but Mark had learned to appreciate its strength after losing too many big fish to lighter tackle. After 20 minutes, a slight tug on the line brought Mark's attention back to his rod. He said that at first he thought it wasn't a fish, probably just the current pushing his weight against some underwater obstruction. But Mark lifted the rod and felt weight, not the dead pull of a snag, but something with substance and resistance. Mark felt his pulse quicken as he prepared for what might be a significant fish. But what happened next would replay in Mark's mind for the rest of his life. The weight on his line suddenly intensified, not with the gradual increase typical of a feeding fish, but with a shocking, immediate force that nearly tore the rod from his hands. The power was immense, steady, and strangely purposeful. Not the erratic runs and jumps typical of a hooked salmon, but something that seemed to be testing the limits of his equipment with deliberate intent. Mark braced his feet against the rocky shore and leaned back, trying to gain some leverage against whatever was on the other end of his line. The drag continued its high-pitched whine as the line disappeared from his reel at an alarming rate. He'd stated that he started the evening with nearly 200 yards of backing, but at that rate, he'd be down to the spool in minutes. But the movement stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Mark found himself holding a rod, bent nearly double, the line taut as a guitar string, connected to something that had simply decided to stop moving. He tried to pump the rod, working to regain some line, but whatever he'd hooked remained absolutely motionless. It was like being connected to a submerged car. Then the movement resumed, but now it was different. Not the steady pull of before, but a series of short, powerful jerks that sent shockwaves up through the rod and into Mark's arms. Each jerk was followed by a brief pause, as if whatever was on the other end was testing different angles or approaches. The pattern was too regular, too methodical to be the random struggles of a hooked fish. Mark's lantern flickered as a gust of wind moved through the trees, casting dancing shadows across the water. In that brief moment of shifting light, he thought he saw something break the surface near the far bank. Not the silver flash of a fish, but something dark and substantial that disappeared before he could focus on it. The line went slack. Mark reeled frantically, expecting to find his hook straightened or his line broken. But as he retrieved the slack, he felt weight again. Not the dead weight of a snag, but something moving slowly through the water toward his position. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Whatever he'd hooked was swimming directly toward him. This was the moment when Mark's 15 years of fishing experience became irrelevant. Every instinct told him that fish didn't behave this way, that nothing in the river should be able to generate the kind of sustained power he'd just experienced. But the evidence was undeniable. Something large and strong was connected to his line, and it was approaching his position with what seemed like deliberate intent. The water near the bank began to roil and churn as something large moved just beneath the surface. Mark could see the disturbance clearly in his lantern light, a V-shaped wake that suggested something swimming with purpose rather than struggling against a hook. The wake was too large, too organized, too directed to be anything he recognized. What could be strong enough to move like that? Mark's hands began to shake as he continued to reel, no longer trying to fight whatever was on his line, but simply responding to its approach. The rod remained bent, the line tight, but now he was following rather than leading. Whatever was down there had taken control of the situation, and Mark was beginning to understand that he was no longer fishing. He was being fished. The churning water moved closer to shore, and Mark caught his first clear glimpse of what he'd hooked. What he saw in that moment would shatter every assumption he'd ever made about the natural world. The hook was embedded in thick, matted fur, covering what was unmistakably a forearm. Not the sleek hide of a river otter or the coarse coat of a bear, but something that belonged to no animal Mark had ever encountered. The fur was dark, almost black in the lantern light, and hung in heavy, waterlogged clumps that dripped river water back into the current. Embedded throughout the matted coat were fragments of vegetation, pine needles, moss, small twigs, as if the creature had been moving through dense forest before entering the water. But it was the arm itself that made Mark's breath catch in his throat. The proportions were wrong for any known animal, too long and too heavily muscled, with a structure that suggested both immense strength and surprising dexterity. The forearm alone appeared to be nearly 3 feet in length, covered in that strange thick fur that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the lantern's glow. Mark's fishing rod remained bent in a deep arc. The 80-pound braided line stretched taut between his reel and whatever was attached to his hook. The tension remained constant, as if the creature was simply allowing itself to be connected rather than fighting to escape. This passive acceptance was perhaps more unsettling than any struggle would have been. Why wasn't it pulling away? The water continued to churn as more of the creature became visible. Mark caught glimpses of a massive torso, broad shoulders that seemed to span an impossible width, and what appeared to be another arm moving beneath the surface. The scale was overwhelming. This was not just large, but enormous in a way that challenged his ability to process what he was seeing. Then the eyes appeared. He said that 2 points of reflected light caught the lantern's beam and held it, staring directly at Mark from a distance of perhaps 30 feet. They were positioned too high above the water, too far apart and too intelligent in their focus to belong to any animal he knew. Was it assessing him as prey or something else? Mark found himself frozen, rod still in his hands, staring back at those reflected eyes across the dark water. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but his body seemed incapable of movement. He said that the creature remained motionless as well, as if both man and beast were locked in a moment of mutual assessment that neither was prepared to break. The smell hit him then. He described a complex mixture of wet fur, river mud, and something else, something wild and organic that he couldn't identify. The odor was so strong and distinctive that Mark knew he would recognize it instantly if he ever encountered it again. The creature began to move toward shore with deliberate, powerful strokes that sent waves lapping against the rocky bank. Mark could see more of its form now, the massive head and shoulders, the incredible breadth of its chest, the way it moved through the water with an efficiency that spoke of both strength and familiarity with aquatic environments. This was not an animal that had accidentally fallen into the river, but one that was completely at home. Had he stumbled onto a creature evolved for both land and water? As it approached the shallows, the creature's full size became apparent. Even partially submerged, it was clear that this was something of extraordinary proportions. Easily 8 feet tall, possibly more, with a body mass that Mark estimated at well over 400 pounds. The way it moved suggested that every ounce of that weight was functional muscle, built for power and endurance rather than speed. The creature reached the shallows and began to rise from the water. Mark watched in fascination and terror as it revealed its full form, water cascading from its massive frame like a primordial emergence from some ancient world. The torso was barrel-shaped and incredibly broad, covered in the same dark matted fur that hung in heavy clumps. The arms were disproportionately long, reaching nearly to what would have been knee level on a human, with hands that appeared both massive and surprisingly articulated. But it was when the creature stood to its full height that Mark truly understood the magnitude of what he was witnessing. The thing towered above the riverbank, easily 9 feet tall, its head nearly lost in the shadows above the lantern's reach. The proportions were simultaneously human-like and utterly alien, familiar enough to be recognizable, strange enough to be terrifying. How could something so humanoid exist undiscovered? The creature examined the fishing line that connected them, following it with its eyes from Mark's rod to where the hook was embedded in its forearm. There was no sign of pain or distress, only what appeared to be curiosity about this unexpected connection. Then, with a movement so casual it seemed almost dismissive, the creature reached across with its free hand and grabbed the braided fishing line. Mark watched in disbelief as those massive fingers closed around the 80-pound test line, meant to hold the biggest fish in the Pacific Northwest, and snapped it as easily as breaking a twig. To put it in perspective, that line was designed to handle the pull of a full-grown grizzly bear's swipe if it were hooked on it. But this creature did it with one hand, without any effort. The sound was sharp and final, like a small whip cracking. Mark's rod straightened instantly, the sudden release nearly knocking him backward off his log. He stared at the loose line hanging from his rod tip, then back at the creature, which now studied the broken end with what seemed like casual curiosity. Later, it hit him. Nothing alive, he knew, could combine that kind of raw strength with such careful, deliberate control. The line hadn't frayed or stretched. It had simply been cut in one effortless motion. What kind of animal could do that? But in the moment, Mark was focused entirely on the creature itself, which had now turned its full attention to removing the hook from its arm. He watched as those enormous hands worked with surprising delicacy, grasping the hook's shank and working it free from the matted fur with careful, precise movements. There was a brief flinch, the first sign of discomfort the creature had shown, as the barbed point pulled free, but no sound of pain or distress. The creature examined the hook for a moment, turning it over in its palm as if studying this strange artifact from the human world. Then it looked directly at Mark, and in that moment of eye contact, Mark said he felt something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. the unmistakable sense that he was being evaluated by an intelligence that was both alien and familiar, primitive and sophisticated. The vocalization that followed was unlike anything Mark had ever heard. It began as a low rumble, so deep that he felt it as much as heard it, a vibration that seemed to resonate in his chest cavity and travel through his bones. The sound built gradually, taking on harmonic overtones that suggested a complex vocal apparatus capable of producing sounds far beyond the range of any known animal. The rumble evolved into something that was almost speech-like, a series of modulated tones that carried clear emotional content even though Mark could not understand their meaning. There was no aggression in the sound, no threat or challenge, but rather something that seemed almost conversational, as if the creature was attempting to communicate something important. Mark tried to speak, but only a stammered gasp escaped him. Would it even recognize him as a being worth responding to? The creature tilted its massive head at the sound of his voice, and Mark caught his first clear glimpse of its face in the lantern light. The features were undeniably primate-like, but scaled up to proportions that seemed impossible. The brow ridge was pronounced and heavy, shadowing eyes that reflected the light with an intelligence that was unmistakably aware. The nose was broad and flat, the mouth wide and expressive. The creature made another vocalization, softer this time. According to him, it was almost questioning in tone. It took a step closer to the bank, and Mark could see the water streaming from its massive frame, pooling at its feet in the rocky shallows. The movement was fluid and controlled, showing no sign of the awkwardness that might be expected from such a large creature moving from water to land. Mark's analytical mind, trained by years of observing wildlife behavior, noted details that would later prove crucial to investigators attempting to understand what had occurred. The creature's gait was distinctly bipedal, with a stride length and foot placement that suggested a being perfectly adapted to walking upright. Its balance was excellent, showing none of the forward lean or knuckle-walking posture associated with known great apes. He later told investigators that, at that moment, he was thinking that he caught Bigfoot with his fishing rod. The creature reached down and picked up a smooth river stone, examining it briefly before setting it aside. The gesture was casual, almost absent-minded, but it demonstrated a level of manual dexterity that was remarkable for hands of such size. Mark could see that the fingers were long and articulated, with what appeared to be opposable thumbs. Was it planning something, or simply playing? Another step brought the creature to the very edge of the water, close enough that Mark could see individual droplets falling from its fur, close enough that the wild organic smell became almost overwhelming. The creature was now less than 20 feet away, well within the circle of light cast by the lantern, and Mark could observe details that would be burned into his memory forever. The fur was not uniform in color or texture. While predominantly dark brown or black, there were patches of lighter coloration around the face and chest, and areas where the fur appeared to have been worn thin by contact with vegetation or rough surfaces. The overall impression was of a creature that lived entirely in the wild, with no contact with human civilization or domestication. Then the creature did something that would change Mark's understanding of what he was witnessing. It reached down and picked up another stone, this one larger and more angular than the first. But instead of examining it and setting it aside, the creature drew back its arm and hurled the stone into the forest with tremendous force. The sound of the stone crashing through branches and undergrowth was followed immediately by a response, another vocalization, similar to the one the creature had made, but coming from somewhere in the darkness beyond the lantern's reach. The creature called again, a complex series of tones that carried clearly across the water, and was answered by what sounded like at least two other voices from different directions in the forest. Mark's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. This creature was not alone. There were others out there in the darkness, others that were now aware of his presence and the unusual situation unfolding on the riverbank. The thought of multiple creatures of this size and apparent intelligence moving through the forest around him was almost too terrifying to contemplate. How many were watching him right now? Then it stopped and stood motionless in the shallows. Mark said that the dim light caught the glint of its eyes, fixed and unblinking, as if weighing a decision. Every instinct in his body screamed to move, yet he couldn't. The creature's stillness was more terrifying than any charge could have been. The creature in the water made one final vocalization, longer and more complex than the others, and Mark had the distinct impression that it was providing some kind of report or explanation to its unseen companions. Then it looked directly at Mark one final time, and in that gaze, Mark said he saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. There was recognition there and evaluation, and what might have been a form of respect or acknowledgement. But he said that there was also something else, something that spoke of vast intelligence, of a being that understood far more about the world than Mark had ever imagined possible. The broken fishing line hung limply from his rod tip, one of the few physical evidences that the encounter had been real, rather than some elaborate hallucination. But Mark knew with absolute certainty that what he had experienced was genuine, that in front of him, from the depths of the Ho River, this creature of impossible proportions had examined his hook, evaluated his presence, and chosen not to strike, but not to leave either. Little did he know, that night wasn't about to end in peace. The silence that followed the creature's continued presence was more unsettling than any sound could have been. His mind struggled to process what he had witnessed, cycling between rational explanations that fell apart under scrutiny and the impossible truth that something beyond current scientific understanding had just examined him with obvious intelligence. Then came a sound, soft, deliberate footfalls from the tree line behind him. Another shape shifted in the darkness, tall and broad-shouldered like the first, and then another beside it. Their silhouettes were barely distinguishable, but unmistakably upright, their eyes catching faint glimmers of light. They weren't hiding anymore. He was reminded of his vulnerability. He was alone in the wilderness, miles from the nearest road, with only a small circle of light protecting him from whatever else might be moving through the darkness. The realization was no longer just a thought, it was visible. 3 of them now stood beyond the riverbank, unmoving, half shrouded in mist. One turned its head slowly, tracking his every movement. The air felt heavier, charged with something that wasn't quite a threat, but wasn't curiosity anymore, either. Those same deep vocalizations he had heard during the encounter were now coming from multiple directions, not just those 3. The sounds were not random or chaotic, but seemed to follow a pattern that suggested coordination and purpose. Mark had spent enough time in the wilderness to recognize the difference between animals moving naturally through their environment and the deliberate movement of creatures with specific intent. Whatever these creatures are, they're organized, and they were moving in a way that seemed designed to surround his position. But what happened to the peaceful encounter moments ago? Was that designed so he would lower his guard, or were there disagreements between those creatures? Mark's survival instincts finally overcame his paralysis. He began packing his gear with urgent efficiency, stuffing items into his tackle box and backpack without regard for organization. The lantern would have to stay lit until the last possible moment. The thought of being plunged into complete darkness while those things moved through the forest around him was unbearable. As he worked, Mark caught glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision. Large shapes shifting between trees just beyond the lantern's reach, always disappearing when he turned to look directly. The movements were too large and too coordinated to be bears or other known wildlife, and they seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance from his position, as if observing rather than approaching. The sound of breaking branches grew closer, and Mark realized that whatever was out there was no longer content to remain hidden. He could hear what sounded like deliberate tree breaking, not the random crack of dead wood falling, but the systematic snapping of living branches, as if something was clearing a path through the forest. The sounds came from at least 5 different directions, suggesting multiple creatures working in coordination. Could he outrun them, or was it already too late? Mark grabbed his lantern and held it high, trying to extend its circle of illumination as far as possible. In the wavering light, he caught his first clear glimpse of one of the creature's companions, a massive silhouette standing motionless between two large cedars, easily as large as the being he had encountered in the water. The figure was there for only a moment before melting back into the darkness, but it was long enough for Mark to confirm that he was dealing with aggressive creatures of extraordinary size and apparent intelligence. The realization that he was surrounded by unknown beings of such aggression triggered a primal fear response that overrode all rational thought. Mark abandoned any pretense of orderly packing and began stuffing essential items into his backpack with desperate haste. His truck was parked nearly a mile away along a winding forest trail, and the thought of making that journey through darkness while being stalked by creatures of unknown intent filled him with terror. Another sound froze him in place, a low, rhythmic thumping that seemed to come from the ground itself. Mark realized that one of the creatures was striking something against a tree trunk, producing a deep, resonant sound that carried clearly through the forest. The rhythm was complex and deliberate, unmistakably a form of communication rather than random noise. The thumping was answered by similar sounds from other directions, creating a network of acoustic signals that surrounded Mark's position. The pattern was too sophisticated to be coincidental. These creatures could also coordinate their movements through complex signaling. Mark slung his backpack over his shoulders and picked up his tackle box, leaving only the lantern and his broken fishing rod. Then the thumping stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence so complete that Mark could hear his own heartbeat. The sudden cessation of sound was more ominous to him than the communication had been, suggesting that whatever was out there had finished coordinating and was now ready to act. Mark knew that he could not afford to wait any longer. He kicked the lantern toward the water's edge, hoping that the sudden movement and change in lighting might create enough confusion to cover his escape. The lantern struck a rock and went out instantly. Mark heard a tremendous roar from somewhere behind him, a sound of such volume and fury that it seemed to shake the very ground beneath his feet. Mark ran blindly into the forest, crashing through undergrowth and stumbling over fallen logs in his desperate attempt to reach his truck. Behind him, he could hear the sounds of large bodies moving through the trees, accompanied by more of those deafening roars that spoke of rage and perhaps frustration. The creatures were no longer attempting stealth. They were pursuing him with obvious intent. Were they hunting or just chasing him for sport? Branches whipped across Mark's face as he ran, and roots caught at his feet, sending him stumbling through the darkness, but he didn't dare slow down. The sounds of pursuit were getting closer, and he could hear the crash of undergrowth being trampled by creatures of enormous size and strength. A particularly loud crash from directly behind him spurred Mark to even greater speed. He could hear heavy breathing and the sound of large feet pounding against the forest floor, suggesting that at least one of the creatures was in direct pursuit. The thought of being caught by something of such size and apparent strength filled him with a terror that transcended rational thought. Mark burst through a stand of young alders and found himself on the familiar trail that led back to the logging road where he had parked. The packed earth felt solid and reassuring under his feet after the treacherous terrain of the forest floor, and he was able to increase his pace significantly. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit had taken on a different quality, less frantic crashing and more purposeful movement, as if his pursuers had settled into a sustainable pace for a long chase. Heavy impacts echoed through the trees, rhythmic and coordinated. He could hear them spreading out, flanking him. The forest that had always felt vast now seemed to close in, every shadow filled with movement. Mark rounded a familiar bend and saw the blessed sight of his truck's reflectors gleaming in the distance. He fumbled for his keys as he ran, praying that he wouldn't drop them in his haste to escape. A deep guttural call rolled through the darkness behind him, answered by another closer to his right. The sound froze his blood. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Branches snapped just beyond the reach of his headlamp, something massive keeping pace with him at a terrifyingly steady speed. The truck's door handle felt like salvation under his trembling fingers. Mark threw his gear into the passenger seat and started the engine with shaking hands, not bothering with his seatbelt in his urgency to leave the area. The headlights illuminated the forest road ahead, creating a tunnel of light that led away from the nightmare he had just experienced. As the engine roared to life, a figure emerged from the brush to his left, taller than the hood, shoulders brushing the side mirror as it lunged forward. Mark slammed the accelerator, the tires spinning in the loose gravel before gripping. Something struck the rear panel with a deafening metallic thud, rocking the truck sideways. He sped down the narrow dirt road, headlights bouncing violently over ruts and potholes. In the rearview mirror, the beams of his taillights caught them. 3 silhouettes bursting from the tree line, sprinting upright through the dust. Their strides were unnaturally long, their movements fast and deliberate. One veered onto the road behind him, running straight down the center like a predator closing on prey. Another darted parallel to the truck, vanishing and reappearing between the trees, matching his speed. Mark's breathing came in short, panicked bursts as he took a sharp corner too fast, the truck fishtailing dangerously before he regained control. Gravel sprayed in all directions. He could hear them, heavy footfalls pounding against the earth, then another impact on the truck's tailgate. A deep dent appeared in the metal, visible even through the shaking red light of the rear camera. Something slapped the bed hard enough to rattle the toolbox inside. He floored the gas, the engine screaming, the forest whipping by in blurs of motion. For several unbearable seconds, the silhouettes remained visible in his mirrors, their glowing eyes locked on him, relentless. Then, as he hit the paved section near the highway turnoff, the shapes slowed. One stopped in the middle of the road, illuminated clearly in the receding taillights. A massive, dark figure standing upright, chest heaving, arms hanging loosely at its sides. 2 more joined it from the shadows, forming a silent line across the dirt road. None followed beyond the forest's edge. He left the site in silence, never returning to the Hoh River, haunted by the memory of eyes in the dark. It was October 21, 2016, when Cara DeLange hiked alone into a remote section of Plumas National Forest. Just after midnight, she reached the trailhead northwest of Quincy, drawn back by weeks of strange vocalizations recorded near a dry creek bed, deep sounds that didn't match any known animal and seemed to answer when she approached. Tonight, she brought a camera. The 40-minute hike through dense fog kept her tense. The temperature hovered in the low 40s. By 1 a.m., she crouched near Manzanita for stability, her recorder clipped on, her audio station blinking nearby. Then the forest fell unnaturally quiet. She felt watched before she heard anything at all. A faint sound came from upslope, not a footfall, but the soft compression of forest debris under significant weight. Then nothing. She waited. Her hand tightened slightly on the camera, but she did not move. Minutes passed. The air felt heavier. She caught a scent on the wind, faint and organic. Musky? Not the sharp smell of a bear or the distinctive odor of a mountain lion. Something else. Something she could not identify. Another sound. Closer now. The snap of a small twig, followed by absolute stillness. Whatever was out there had stopped moving. It was evaluating her, testing whether she was a threat. She kept her posture relaxed, non-threatening, and waited for it to decide. The motion sensor on her audio station remained green. Whatever was watching her was staying just outside the detection radius. Deliberate, controlled. At 1:14 a.m., she heard the first sound. It came from downslope, maybe 50 feet away, hidden in the fog. A low, guttural hum that lasted 4 seconds and then stopped. The sound was deep enough that she felt it in her chest, a vibration that seemed to resonate through her ribcage. It did not sound like a bear. It did not sound like anything she had encountered before. The tone was controlled, sustained, and deliberate. Cara stood motionless, her pulse quickening. She adjusted the camera angle toward the source of the sound and waited for it to come again. Her breathing slowed. She focused on listening, filtering out the wind and the distant rustle of branches. 40 seconds passed. Then the sound repeated, this time closer. It was the same low rumble, but shorter, with a rising inflection at the end. It sounded like a question, like the source was testing whether she was still there, like it was trying to provoke a response. She did not respond. She kept her breathing shallow and her movements minimal. The motion sensor on her audio station switched from red to green. Something had entered the detection radius, something large enough to trigger the infrared beam. At 1:17 a.m., she saw movement. A shape emerged from the fog near the creek bed, roughly 40 feet away. It was tall, far taller than any human, and broad through the shoulders. The figure moved slowly, taking deliberate steps through the underbrush. It was upright, walking on two legs, and covered in dark fur or hair that blended with the shadows. The head was massive, the arms hung past the hips, and the posture was stable and controlled. The gait was smooth, not the lumbering shuffle of a bear. What happened next would change everything Kara thought she knew about intelligence in the wild. The creature was not simply searching for food. It was not marking territory. What it was about to do had never been documented in any Sasquatch encounter on record. Kara's hands tightened around the camera. She kept the lens steady, filming the figure as it moved closer to the audio station. The creature stopped approximately 20 feet from the tripod and stood completely still. It was facing the equipment, as if examining it, as if trying to understand what it was. For nearly a minute, nothing happened. The creature did not move. Kara did not move. The only sound was the wind through the trees and the faint hum of the recorder running on her jacket. Then the creature made a sound. It was not the deep rumble from before. This sound was different. It started low, then shifted into a mid-range tone and ended with a sharp exhalation. The rhythm was deliberate, broken into 3 distinct pulses. It sounded almost like speech, like the creature was trying to form words, like it was attempting to mimic the cadence of human language. Kara's breath caught. She had heard vocalizations on her recordings before, but this was different. This was intentional, structured. The creature was attempting to communicate. She stayed silent, unsure of what to do. The creature turned slightly, shifting its weight, and the motion sensor blinked twice before returning to solid green. The figure was still within detection range, but it had moved. It was no longer facing the equipment. It was facing her direction. Kara froze. She could see the outline clearly now. The creature was looking directly at her. It had seen her immediately. At 1:21 a.m., the creature took 2 steps forward. The movement was smooth and controlled, closing the distance to roughly 30 feet. Kara's heart pounded. She considered retreating, but movement might provoke a response. She remained crouched, keeping the camera raised, and filmed. Her hands were steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. The creature stopped again. It tilted its head slightly, as if listening. Then it made another sound. This one was quieter, more controlled, and contained a clear vowel sound in the middle. The sound was drawn out and resonant, followed by a soft consonant at the end. It resembled the structure of human speech, but rendered in a voice too deep and too powerful to belong to any person. Kara realized the creature was experimenting with its voice, testing sounds, exploring what it could produce. She made a decision. She cleared her throat softly, just loud enough to be heard. The creature reacted immediately. Its head snapped toward her, and its body shifted into a slightly crouched posture. For 3 seconds, it remained motionless. Then it repeated the sound it had just made, but louder this time. The vowel sound echoed through the trees, hanging in the cold air. Kara's pulse spiked. She decided to respond. She spoke a single word of greeting, keeping her voice low and calm. The word hung in the air. The creature tilted its head again, processing the sound. Then, after a pause of nearly 10 seconds, it made a sound in response. The sound that came out was deep, guttural, and formless. There was a faint echo of her vocal tone, but nothing resembled actual syllables. It was attempting something, but the result was crude and unrefined. Kara's hands started shaking. She spoke the word again, slower this time, enunciating carefully. The creature responded with another sound. it was no clearer than the first. The vocalization was rough, breathy, with no discernible pattern. Whatever the creature was doing, it was not producing anything close to human speech. Kara felt a mix of fear and awe. She raised the camera higher, ensuring the lens captured the figure in the frame. The recording light blinked steadily, documenting everything. At 1:23 a.m., the creature took several more steps forward, now standing approximately 25 feet away. Kara could see more detail now. The body was covered in dark brown or black hair, matted and uneven. The shoulders were impossibly wide, easily 3 feet across, and the chest was deep and barrel-shaped. The arms were long and muscular, extending well past the hips, and the hands were large, with thick fingers that hung loosely at its sides. The face was partially obscured by shadow, but she could see the shape of a heavy brow ridge and a pronounced jaw. The head was conical, rising to a peak at the crown. The creature shifted its weight, and Kara observed how it moved. The feet were broad and flat, designed for stability on uneven terrain. Each step was planted carefully, heel first, then rolling forward to the toes. The movement was fluid and controlled, nothing like the stiff gait of a person in a costume. The knees bent naturally, absorbing the creature's mass with each shift. Its arms hung loosely at its sides, the hands occasionally flexing open and closed. The fingers were thick and powerful, capable of gripping branches or tearing bark. As she watched, the creature reached out and touched the trunk of a nearby pine tree. The motion was exploratory, not aggressive. It ran its palm down the bark, testing the texture, then brought its hand to its face briefly. Scent checking. The behavior mirrored what she had seen in gorillas investigating new territory. The creature's shoulders rolled as it adjusted its posture. The musculature was dense and powerful, designed for climbing and pulling. The chest expanded with each breath, the ribcage visible beneath the hair. The head turned slowly from side to side, scanning the area with methodical precision. The ears, small and close to the skull, twitched occasionally, tracking sounds Kara could not hear. It crouched slightly and placed one hand on the ground, balancing its weight between 3 points of contact. The posture was cautious, non-threatening, but ready. Kara noticed something else: a smell. It was faint at first, carried on the cold air between them, but it grew stronger as the creature moved. The odor was musky and organic, like wet animal fur mixed with earth and something else she could not identify. It was not unpleasant, but it was distinctly wild. The scent confirmed what her eyes were telling her. This was not a person in a costume. This was a living creature with its own biology, its own presence. The creature's breathing was audible now. Deep, measured breaths that created small clouds of condensation in the cold air. Each exhale produced a soft rushing sound, like wind through a cave opening. The respiratory capacity was enormous. Whatever this creature was, its lungs were far larger than any human's. The creature made another sound. This one was different. It was not a mimicry attempt. It was a vocalization from its own repertoire, a low, rhythmic hum that rose and fell in pitch. The sound lasted nearly 8 seconds and contained multiple tonal shifts. The pattern was structured, but whether it carried specific meaning or was simply a complex call remained unknowable. Kara did not understand the sounds, but she recognized the pattern. The creature remained still and vocalized after she spoke, matching her timing rather than her words. It was not threatening her. It was not charging or displaying aggression. She decided to keep talking. She spoke slowly, enunciating each word, and introduced herself by name. The creature listened. Its head tilted again, and its body remained still. The massive chest rose and fell with each breath. After a pause of nearly 15 seconds, it attempted to respond. The sound that emerged was a low rumble, followed by a sharper vocalization. The sounds were rough and lacked any clear structure. Whatever the creature was doing, it bore no resemblance to speech. She repeated her name alone, speaking it clearly and deliberately. The creature responded with a sound that was low and guttural. There was no clear pattern, no recognizable attempt at replication. It was simply vocalizing in response to her voice. Kara felt tears welling in her eyes, though she did not know if it was from fear or wonder. She was standing face to face with something that was not human, something that was reacting to her movements and voice. At 1:31 a.m., the creature crouched slightly and placed one hand on the ground. The motion was deliberate, non-threatening. It was lowering itself to appear less imposing. Kara noticed the hand was enormous, easily twice the size of her own, with long fingers and thick nails that resembled claws, but appeared blunt. The palm was broad and covered in the same dark hair that covered the rest of the body. The creature made another sound, this time softer. It was a single syllable, drawn out and gentle. The tone was calm, almost soothing. Kara responded in kind, keeping her voice low and steady. She spoke reassuring words, though she suspected the creature understood tone more than language. She told it she meant no harm, that she was simply observing, that she was not a threat. The creature did not repeat her words this time. Instead, it made a series of sounds, separated by pauses. The vocalizations varied in pitch and duration, suggesting some kind of internal structure, but Kara could not identify any patterns that resembled human language. Kara decided to try something. She reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a granola bar. She unwrapped it slowly, the crinkling of the wrapper loud in the silence. The creature's head shifted immediately, tracking the sound with precision. Kara broke off a piece of the bar and held it out in her open palm, extending her arms slowly and deliberately. She kept her movements non-threatening, her posture relaxed. The creature stared at her hand. It did not move toward her, but it did not retreat either. Its eyes, barely visible in the darkness, remained fixed on the offering. After a long pause of nearly 20 seconds, it made a soft sound, almost like a hum of acknowledgement. Then it stood upright again, rising to its full height of over 7 feet. The motion was fluid, effortless, demonstrating immense strength and balance. Kara lowered her hand, realizing the creature was not interested in the food. It was interested in the interaction itself. At 1:38 a.m., the creature spoke again. This time, the sound was more complex. It started with a low hum, transitioned into a mid-range tone, and ended with what might have been a stopped consonant. The structure suggested deliberate vocal control, but the meaning was impossible to decipher. Kara listened carefully. She responded, keeping her tone gentle. She told the creature she did not understand, but that she was listening. The creature tilted its head, processing her words. Then it repeated the sound. The consistency suggested the vocalization had meaning within the creature's own communication system, but what that meaning was remained unknowable. The creature then did something unexpected. It placed its hand on its own chest, over the area where a human heart would be. The gesture was deliberate. It held the position for 3 seconds while making a low, rumbling sound. The behavior resembled a posture shift or calming gesture, similar to what great apes do when displaying non-aggression. Kara felt a chill run through her. She was witnessing something that defied easy explanation. A creature attempting to interact with her through vocalizations and physical gestures. At 1:43 a.m., the creature made a new sound. This one was sharper, more urgent. It was a single syllable, repeated 3 times in quick succession. The rhythm was staccato, insistent. The tone had shifted from curiosity to urgency. The creature was making an urgent call, trying to focus her awareness on something specific. She responded, telling the creature she was listening, that she was paying attention. The creature took a step back, creating more distance. Its body turned partially toward the forest upslope. One arm moved outward slightly, not a clear point, but a directional motion. The head turned in the same direction. The message was readable, but subtle. Something in that direction had its attention. What the creature had sensed was already approaching. Within minutes, Kara would understand why the creature was trying to warn her. and she would realize that the alarm call it was about to make would be the difference between making it out of the forest alive or becoming another disappearance statistic in Plumas County. Kara followed the line of the creature's gesture, trying to see what it was indicating. She could make out the dark shapes of trees and underbrush. She did not understand what the creature was trying to communicate. Was there something in that direction? Was it warning her? Was it trying to show her something? She looked back at the creature and shook her head slowly, trying to convey her confusion. The creature lowered its arm. It made another sound, this one forceful and sustained. The vocalization was a single sharp exhalation followed by a drawn-out low tone. It did not sound like any English word, but the urgency was unmistakable. Kara's stomach tightened. Whatever the sound meant in the creature's communication system, the tone conveyed alarm. She asked the creature to clarify, her voice shaking slightly. The creature repeated the sound, louder and more insistent this time. The urgency had intensified. Kara felt a wave of fear wash over her. The creature was not being aggressive, but the urgency in its tone was clear. Something was wrong. Something had changed. The creature had detected something she could not yet perceive. She took a slow step backward, keeping her eyes on the creature. It did not follow. It simply stood there, watching her, its massive frame tense and alert, focused on something beyond her position. At 1:47 a.m., Kara heard another sound. This one did not come from the creature in front of her. It came from deeper in the forest, upslope, in the direction the creature had indicated. It was another vocalization, similar in register, but different in tone, lower, more resonant. The sound carried differently through the trees. The creature in front of her reacted immediately. Its entire posture changed. The shoulders squared, the head lowered slightly. It turned fully toward the new sound and made a sharp vocalization in response. The sound was loud, forceful, and carried territorial assertion. The response from upslope was another deep vocalization. The first creature responded immediately with a louder, more forceful call. The sound resonated through the trees, a deep boom that Kara felt in her chest. It was a territorial assertion, clear and unmistakable. The creature squared its shoulders and turned fully toward the source of the approaching presence. From upslope came another call, lower in pitch and longer in duration. The second creature was answering the challenge. The first creature responded with 3 sharp exhalations in rapid succession, each one louder than the last. The pattern was aggressive, escalating. Then came a sound Kara had only heard in documentaries about gorillas. The first creature grabbed a dead branch from a nearby shrub and snapped it cleanly in half. The crack echoed through the forest. It dropped the broken pieces and made another vocalization, this one sharper and more insistent. The display was unmistakable, a show of strength, a warning. The second creature responded with its own call, but this time the tone had shifted. It was lower, less aggressive. The first creature held its ground, chest expanded, head slightly lowered. It made one more call, sustained and forceful, then waited. Silence. 10 seconds passed. 20. The first creature remained motionless, body oriented upslope, maintaining its defensive posture. Then, faintly, Kara heard movement in the distance. Not approaching, retreating. The second creature was backing down. The first creature did not relax immediately. It remained tense, listening, ensuring the threat had passed. Only after a full minute of silence did its posture begin to shift. The territorial challenge was over. The boundary had been established. The creature made one final vocalization toward the forest, then turned its head back toward Kara. It repeated the urgent sound it had made earlier. The creature took one step in her direction, not threateningly, but insistently. Its body angled slightly toward the trail. The message was clear even without words. She needed to leave. Kara understood. There was another one, and whatever was approaching had triggered a territorial response from the first creature. The creature in front of her was asserting dominance over this section of forest. Kara just happened to be within the boundaries it was defending. She nodded quickly and took another step back, acknowledging the situation. The creature did not respond with vocalizations this time. It simply held its position, body-oriented, toward the source of the approaching threat. Its posture was defensive, territorial. Whatever was coming was violating claimed space, and the first creature was making its stance clear. Kara turned and moved quickly but carefully through the underbrush, heading back toward the trail. She kept the camera running, though she was no longer filming anything useful. Her focus was on getting out. She heard another exchange of vocalizations in the distance. The two creatures were still calling back and forth, establishing territorial boundaries through sound. She did not look back. She moved as quickly as the terrain allowed, her headlamp cutting through the darkness. The forest felt different now. The atmosphere had shifted. As she moved, she became aware of movement somewhere in the forest to her left. Not close, but present. She could hear occasional sounds through the undergrowth, but nothing that suggested active pursuit. Whatever was out there was moving through its own territory, not chasing her specifically. Kara maintained her pace. Her heart hammered. The sounds to her left faded after another minute. The forest went quiet again. By 1:52 a.m., she reached the trail. She broke into a jog, her breath coming in short bursts. She did not stop until she was back at the trailhead, standing next to her vehicle with the doors locked. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely grip the keys. She sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes, her hands still shaking, her heart still racing, before she finally started the engine. She drove back to Quincy in silence, replaying the encounter in her mind. The creature had made vocalizations in response to her voice, and when a territorial dispute began, she had been caught in the middle. The first creature's behavior had bought her time to leave, whether intentionally or simply as a side effect of defending its claimed area. The following morning, Kara reviewed the footage on her camera. The video was low resolution and obscured, but the audio was clear. She could hear her own voice, followed by the creature's vocalizations. The sounds were deep, guttural, and bore no resemblance to human speech. She could hear the rhythmic calls. She could hear the final urgent sound before she fled. She played the segments repeatedly. The creature had not produced recognizable words. The vocalization showed some variation, but remained rough and formless. There was no clear pattern of improvement or imitation. What struck her most was the reactivity. The creature did not vocalize randomly. When she made sounds, it responded with its own calls. The exchange had a back-and-forth quality, though the content remained unintelligible. The chest gesture replayed in her mind. The creature had made a deliberate physical motion while vocalizing. The behavior suggested a non-threatening display, though its exact purpose was unclear. Kara saved the file and made multiple backups across different devices and cloud storage. She considered submitting the evidence to the Forest Service or to academic institutions, but she hesitated. The encounter had been too personal, too profound, to hand over to an agency that might dismiss or bury it. The creature had engaged with her in a way she never thought possible. Instead, she kept the footage private. She shared it with only a handful of trusted colleagues under strict confidentiality agreements. The responses were mixed. Some believed the audio was authentic and represented groundbreaking evidence of non-human speech capability. Others questioned the source, suggesting the sounds could have been produced by a human hoaxer or misidentified wildlife. The debate would likely continue for years, but Kara knew what she had experienced. She had been there. She had seen the creature standing less than 25 feet away. She had heard it vocalize in response to her voice. She had heard the urgent calls when territorial conflict began. The creature had not tried to harm her. It had engaged in what appeared to be responsive behavior, though the exact nature of the interaction remained ambiguous. And when another presence arrived, the territorial response had given her the opportunity to leave. Kara returned to the site twice in the following weeks, but she never encountered the creature again. The motion-triggered audio stations continued recording for another month, but the vocalizations stopped. The forest fell silent. Whatever had been there was gone, or had chosen to remain hidden. She completed her graduate program in 2019 and moved to Oregon, where she now works as a conservation biologist. She rarely discusses the encounter, but in private, she has never wavered about what happened that night. The creature was real. The sounds were real. For a few minutes in a fog-covered forest, a human and an unknown primate exchanged sounds that neither fully understood. The footage remains in her possession. No agency has confirmed it, and no similar recordings have surfaced. What stays with her is the memory of a creature responding to her voice, and the realization that its warning gave her the chance to escape. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.